Hi, everybody. Welcome, Lucy. Welcome, Sid, to this talk about vulnerable voices using topic modeling to analyze newspaper coverage of climate change. I do think that the interesting thing is going to be to look at these non-Annex 1 countries. These are not the usual suspects you look into, and I'm really looking forward also what you tell us about your methods and how you did your measurements. Lucy McAllister is an environmental studies PhD and works as a professor of environmental studies at Denison University in Ohio. And Sid Vedula is from the entrepreneurial studies, an economist, and he's a professor of entrepreneurship at the TUM School of Management, right across the street, figuratively speaking. So with not much further ado, go ahead. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Bernhard, for having us, and everyone today here for joining us. We're very excited to have you talk about this paper with you. I will be starting the presentation and concluding it. This is Vulnerable Voices using topic modeling to analyze newspaper coverage of climate change in 26 non-Annex 1 countries. So we're presenting on behalf of our colleagues, Vincent Pu and Maxwell Boykoff, who can't join us today. So we just first wanted to show, luckily we've gotten some press, some media on our article. We all know the importance of the media in shaping perceptions and impressions of work and really, acting as a bridge between our everyday lives and policy and sciences and acting as that translator. So it was very important to us to further disseminate our work. I don't know if anyone knows about the Anthropocene. It's a great magazine, online magazine that translates all sorts of different science for sort of everyday audiences. And they have some excellent journalists. So it's worth checking out. So in terms of our motivation, where did we come up with this idea? So in my research in environmental studies, most of the literature is about European and North American countries. Like Bernhard said, obviously we're focusing on the highest emitting countries. This is also where there's most of the scholars are coming from, the peer-reviewed literature. There's some injustices there in what is published and who is publishing what. And so these vulnerable countries, those facing the worst impact, are really, they're understudied in the media and climate change literature, even though we know they're experiencing the worst of these impacts and have a strong voice. And so when scholars do, there's been a lot of important work that we're hoping to build on with this paper. And scholars have started to study sort of comparative studies of Western and non-Western sources, but they're treating these as sort of a homogeneous block, sort of this comparative research. And they'll often examine Brazil or India and China, the US, the UK, Germany, some other European countries, and these analyses. And it's really valuable work, but we wanted to account for the heterogeneity among non-Annex countries because of these unique cultures, particularly these journalistic cultures, which have significant variations. Obviously, there are social, economic, political differences when you're looking across these countries. So it's very difficult to compare in some ways. And so we thought this was a key limitation of the existing literature, the sort of missing functional equivalence of measurements. And so that's something we wanted to address in this analysis, in addition to the fact that these countries from the Global South are just severely understudied in the media. I think Africa, there's only been 9 papers studied about the entire continent of Africa. So we looked at this by examining an expansive set, I'll get into in a minute, our data of economically similar non-Annex 1 print media over 11 years. So obviously not perfect, but at least they were economically similar. And so like I said, by focusing in on a more similar set of countries, we could examine this interrelatedness of their media coverage on climate change. Because as we all know, I'm sure in this audience, as climate change worsens, and the intensity and frequency of these extreme climate and weather events that we ourselves have perhaps experienced, as they're increasing, the co-occurrence of these climate impacts on vulnerable populations will also rise. So the frequency of these events occurring at the same time. And so we're looking at the media obviously accurately representing that. So we predicted, that the more vulnerable the country, here's our formal hypothesis, the more vulnerable the country, the higher diversity of topics that will be covered because of the greater likelihood of events that it'll be facing simultaneously. So there'll be a positive association between country level climate change vulnerability and the diversity of climate topics covered by the media there. So moving on to the data, we looked at 26 countries. We identified these countries through the World Bank Income Classification Scheme. We could not get sufficient data from the lowest income countries. Either it was not available or it was not available for the entire period of study, which was a limitation. But we were able to get data from all lower and upper middle income countries. And obviously we weren't looking at the high income countries in these geographic areas because our focus was on vulnerable countries. We overall looked at 50 sources. How did we identify these sources? I don't know, this is also a great place to check out the Media and Climate Change Observatory out of the University of Colorado Boulder. This is Dr. Boykoff's lab. He covers with his group global media of climate change monthly and publishes sort of summaries and quantity of news across radio, print, TV, et cetera. And they sort of have created a filter of a lot of great sources. So we looked there, and we also looked at Reuters Institute Digital News Report. And it was from that report that we were able to get, what are the highest circulating English-speaking sources that we could have access to for the entire period of study. So obviously English speaking is a limitation, which we'll discuss at the end, but we did examine English only sources for a variety of reasons, which we'll discuss later. So as I said before, we collected 11 years of data. We used relatively simple search terms because we wanted us to sort of capture everything and tend on that side of climate change or global warming. And this is also what a lot of previous literature, the search terms they use. So in total, we got almost 100,000 articles, over 95,000 articles. And then how did we identify whether it was vulnerable? We were able to find this Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index initiative. And this index has at least 36 different criteria. It looks over at 180 countries, so it covered all of the countries in our sample, and 45 indicators, sorry. So this really helped us identify the characteristics on which these countries were vulnerable and sort of create our scale there. So here is a heat map. Hopefully you can see that, it's a bit dark, of the sample of our 26 countries. You can see, India, we had many more articles on climate change than some of our other countries in our sample, but we did account for this sort of proportionate news coverage in our analysis, but you sort of get a view of all the countries here. And then here's just the news sources, how many articles were in the final sample, that percentage, their vulnerability score is displayed on the right-hand side, and that's from the Notre Dame index. And so now we're moving along. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Vedula, who can dig into our method, because Vincent, our colleague who sort of specializes on this for the paper, isn't here, but he's gonna cover this for us. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Lucy. Thanks for that. Let me share my screen, make it easier as well. Um, can you stop sharing? I think. Okay, thank you. Share mine. Okay. All right. So we were here. I think so. And you guys can see the screen. Everything good? Perfect. So yeah, just as a note, as Lucy was talking, I put the MECO, so the observatory from the Professor Boykoff's website. I put it in the chat, so I don't know if that's picked up in the recording, but anyone on the call, if you're curious, you can look at that in the chat. So yeah, as Lucy mentioned, Vincent is our information systems professor. So he was really he did most of the topic modeling work. I used to be a coder maybe 10 years ago, so I know how to do this, but I wasn't the one who implemented a lot of this. I did all the econometrics, so all the sort of statistical stuff afterwards. So I'll kind of explain this at a high level. And then I can, I'm doing more projects using this. I'm happy to chat about it. But for example, the specific code and stuff, I didn't do that myself. Yeah. So the topic modeling, how does this work? So here's like a silly example, but it should kind of give you the idea, just something I found online. So imagine you have this piece of text in the bottom document or in the box below. So this is a piece of text about the William Randolph Hearst Foundation. What the algorithm does, so this is an old algorithm from the computer sciences, almost going 30 years at this point, maybe even 40 years, is it looks for a word sort of associations or co-occurrences. So in this example, you see all the different words are color coded. So you have red, green, blue, and pink, I guess. And then what the computer will do for you, if you have lots of articles to read, is it looks for words that sort of co-occur together in a corpus document, right? So, and then it gives you a table which looks like this, called a bag of words. It doesn't give you the labels on the top. That's up for you to interpret. So based on your theoretical understanding, but it would just give you a list like an Excel table, which has these words: new, film, show, music, movie, etc. Right? One important thing to understand is every word can appear in any column. It's just the order of the words matters. So one way this is often discussed, and I'll show you the real data from our paper, is that the words that are higher on any given column have a higher probability of basically belonging to that category, right? So in this case, topic modeling, with this example data set, we could argue that there are 4 topics or latent topics inherent in this document to do with budgets, children, education, and arts. Okay. Now, there's lots of different algorithms. There's LSA, latent semantic analysis. There's latent Dirichlet allocation, the one we use for this paper. And we actually used another one called PLDA just because for the processing requirements on a server was implemented in R. So you can pretty much do this pretty easily now on R or Python. As an NLP kind of software to do it. Okay, so for each document, you run an algorithm. It generates these bag of words, as I just showed you on the top left, or what here on the slide says cluster of words. And then more importantly, for each document in your corpus, so in our case, the close to 100,000 documents, it will tell you or it'll give you a probability that for each topic to be associated with that document. So it will say for document 1, which was an article from, say, the Times of India on this day, there is, I don't know, a 3% probability that it's about topic 1, a 4% that it's about topic 2, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So one sort of challenge with topic modeling is it's unsupervised or it's semi-supervised in the sense that the algorithm has no idea what is the correct number of topics in a corpus, right? It's just words for the computer. So the researcher has to kind of experiment a little bit, at least with these algorithms, to understand or to kind of infer what the correct topic structure, the correct number of topics are. So there is a method called sort of tuning curves, or basically topic model tuning. And there are these 4 papers by Griffiths, Cow, Arun, and Devo. And what they did is they devised some metrics to sort of figure out what is the sort of optimal number of topics in a solution. What the panel on the left is showing, so panel A, is for the Griffith and Cow metric. So this basically the squares and the Arun and the Cow, so the squares and the triangles. What you're trying to do is minimize the value of that score, and you try to look for the point where there is no sort of marginal improvement to the score. So if you basically add another topic, which is shown on the x-axis, the score gets lower, but you're looking for sort of the inflection point on this curve, right? Whereas for the circles and the pluses, so that's the Griffiths and the DeVos scores, you're trying to maximize the metric. So again, it's the same idea, but just the inverse, right? Panel B on the right kind of shows the marginal delta. So for every topic you add, we are looking at how much change in the metrics do you get. And then the lines are the fits for these. So what you see is, and you can see it in the information on the bottom of the slide. All this is also in the paper, by the way, in the supplementary analysis. What you see is that around 11 topics. So this is without even reading any of the articles. Yeah, the computer says, yeah, around 10 to 11, 12, around that range. It looks like you get no bang for your buck. So if you add more topics, you basically don't get any improvement in these tuning metrics. So this gives you kind of an initial approximate of what the solution space could look like. So what we did is we ran this, and then we said, okay, now it's important to check what it's actually giving us. So we checked all the solutions starting from, I think, around 7 till about 20, because this was kind of a good window around this sort of cutoff range. And you get something like this. So this is the final solution in the paper. I'm sorry, the last column was cut off, but what you get, we ended up with 11 topics, and and the labels on the top are the ones we gave ourselves. But we did this for 10 topics, 9 topics, 12 topics, 13 topics, etc. Right? If you have too few topics, basically the words are redundant. I mean, they're meaningless because different words get combined into the same bucket. If you have too many topics, you get redundant topics. You start seeing columns that look almost the same to each other. So these are the topics we came up with, and during the review process, we changed the labels a bit. Of course, this is something which is much more subjective. So for example, I'll just pick one, which is maybe easy to understand. So say the second column is water, farmer, food. So clearly it's about farming, agriculture, yeah. Maybe the fifth column is about students, research, universities. So clearly about education, so on and so forth, yeah. And you can come up with these sort of topics. And as I mentioned on the bottom, the words are sorted based on probability of being associated with the topic. So the most commonly occurring word for, say, topic 4, which is the economics of energy transitions, is energ. If you're wondering why the words are cut off, it's because you have to basically stem the words. So energ means energy, energies, all the suffixes, everything that contains. Yeah, there's no actual word obviously called energ. Yeah. And now here's this histogram showing the 11 topics in sorted, so in descending order. So what you see here is that on the y-axis we have the average probability of any given article being about a specific topic, and on the x-axis we have the 11 topics in our data, or which in our model. And then you see, if you sort them, you can see what are the most common topics, which would be the obvious question to ask, right? So you can see that in this data set of almost 100,000 articles, the 3 most common topics are about international governance issues, economics, and the impacts of climate change. So how does it actually impact the population? Whereas something around, for example, say climate activism is quite low, and health as well. So this is kind of interesting as a first pass to say, what does the media actually cover in these countries? Does it focus on issues A or B or C or D? And this kind of gives you a sense of that. Another way to look at the same thing, or sort of a related way, is to do something called a multidimensional scaling. So when you can think of this as being 11-dimensional space now. You have 11 vectors if you want. but that's hard to interpret. I mean, it's hard enough to think in 3D, let alone 11D. So one way to do this is again, an old method called MDS. They actually use this a lot in marketing. So, for example, if you want to see how to close, just using my business background, how similar, say, for example, to brands are in terms of how they advertise stuff. But what you see here is that it will basically compute the principal components. So it tries to reduce the variance between the different topics. And after you rotate sort of the matrix for that, you can basically show that these are two sort of virtual dimensions or principal components, which display what you need to take away from this is the distance between the topics. So as the size of the circles represents how much coverage there is. So that's from the histogram I just showed you. And the distance between the circles that represents how close or far a topic is. So, and then the blue and green things, we just annotated it ourselves manually. So based on our sort of interpretation. So what you can see here, for example, is that educational events, governance issues tend to be sort of discussed together because they're very similar. Similarly, issues around activism and energy and also agriculture tend to be sort of co-discussed in a given article. Whereas culture or US politics is super far from this. So they tend to be discussed individually in an article, right? So that's what you can take away from this. This already shows us that topics are often discussed together, which is what you would expect as we started, as Lucy motivated. If all the circles were totally separate, that would be an indication that topics are not discussed together, but instead discussed in isolation, right? So, but you do see some overlaps. All right. Then through the review process, one of the reviewers asked, yeah, this is cool, but like, what if, can we also look at this by country? What about that? So what we did next was we averaged the topics for each country in our sample, so the 26 countries, and then essentially reran the same analysis. And then you see something really interesting, and we did not expect to see this initially. We noticed that, I mean, and if you're wondering what these weird star constellation shapes are, these are just things we drew in out of interest. But we tried to group the lines or the shapes are trying to represent the different continents in our data set. So we have, I don't know, South Asian countries on the top, so Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and we have a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, etc., the Middle Eastern countries. So as you can expect, the African countries are all sort of clustered together. The Asian countries are clustered together, as you might expect, right? So, India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the media sounds very similar or talking about similar things. What is maybe less obvious is, again, the distances. So South Asian countries basically are more similar in their coverage to the sub-Saharan bloc than, say, the East Asian countries. So when we talk about what Lucy motivated, when we talk about Asian versus African countries, that's actually misleading once you look at it like this, because what you notice is, like, for example, the coverage in India is much closer to that in, say, Kenya than it is to, say, the one even in China or Indonesia, right? So even though they're in different continents. So that's an important outcome. The countries in red are the most vulnerable countries in our sample, based on the data set from Notre Dame. So, and that's something which was really nice that it popped out like this. It happened kind of happenstance in the review process, but it kind of shows us that the vulnerable countries cluster together, right? So even if they're from different continents, all the red countries are all together, which suggests that there must be some association between vulnerability as well as coverage, which was our original argument. 2 points to that: South Africa and Vietnam were kind of outliers, so that's why they're in green on the bottom. They seem to be talking about totally different issues. And when I looked at the data more carefully, it's because South Africa, for example, has a huge focus, at least in our data set, on energy economics. So most of the articles are about that. Just to make sure this wasn't biasing our results, we also dropped them from the analysis and did things like that, and the results are robust. So now we have the next analysis. So this so far, this is just descriptive, right? We're just looking at what's being covered, how is it being said by in different countries, what are the main topics. So next, we wanted to build more of a causal model. Now, just a caveat, true causality is kind of hard because it's obviously it's a social science, but more than that, you could argue that, for example, the vulnerability of a country does not drive the climate change, but there's some reverse causality, right? So it could be that the climate change is, if the media talks a lot about certain stuff, it changes policies, which then influences how vulnerable it is of a country and things like that. So yes, I get those arguments, but to kind of get around that, what you do is we have panel data, so it's not 1 year of data. So we have 11 years of data. You can also change, you lead all the variables and lag other ones. So in this case, the entropy or the measure of our measure of diversity of coverage, which I'll discuss next, is forwarded by 1 year. So we look at, for example, how diverse the news media coverage is in 2012 as a function of a bunch of things in 2011, right? So this is kind of trying to build this causal link. If you're not very familiar with these regression tables, the way it works is you have a set of variables, multivariate regression, trying to predict the outcome, which is on the top, so what's called the DV, and then what you're looking for is levels of statistical significance. So the row on the top, which I've highlighted in gray, is the variable we care about, this measure of vulnerability. It's been standardized, so mean 0, standard deviation 1. And then we control for a whole bunch of other things, such as there's also a readiness score, so that's more about adaptability. And then general controls of the country, such as its population, GDP, HDI, as well as a lot of things about the articles themselves. So because the articles are a different lens, they have different sentiments. So we wanted to control for things like that. And then one could argue, for example, that I don't know, that the way the Times of India writes about things is different than the way I don't know, the Hindu writes about things. So what you can do is include what are called dummy variables. So you add a control for each newspaper in our case. And what this will do is it will account for anything about the newspaper that you cannot measure, but that does not change over time. So maybe the journalistic culture of the Hindu is different. Now we assume that that culture is pretty stable for those 10 years. So I don't know, the CEO didn't change and it didn't change a lot rapidly, but assuming that's the case, you can account for what is called an unobserved variable biases. You can control for that. You have time dummies, so you can also control for any like year to year or in our case, month to month fluctuation. So, we had COP happening in 2016 or Trump became president or, all these things like that. Something that would cause a sudden spike in the news will be picked up by these what are called time fixed effects. So you're basically trying to control for a lot of the variance and still look, once you do that, do you still find an effect of vulnerability? And indeed, we do across the different models. Yeah. So the last thing to mention is how do we measure our dependent variable, which is diversity of coverage? We use a measure called entropy, which comes from physics, or another way to do it is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, HHI. Again, this is used very commonly in business. So can you guys see my PDF now?
Yes, we are seeing the supplementary materials.
Perfect. So HHI is probably easier to understand. Again, in economics, it's a measure of market concentration. So let's take the car industry in Germany. There's probably like 5 companies like BMW, Mercedes, Audi, etc. Right? So it's clearly a concentrated industry. Whereas if you take, I don't know, some consumer goods and stuff, something like that, where there's thousands of companies, it will be less concentrated. So it's a simple way to measure how concentrated or alternately diverse any given measure is, right, or market. So here's what the main thing to focus on is article S1 and S2. So in the supplementary materials, we put 2 examples of what is a high diversity and low diversity. So our example of high diversity is this article from the Dawn in Pakistan from 2014. And what you can see here is, I'm not going to read the whole article, but it's basically an article which is talking about land loss and forest loss. But what's interesting is once you read through it is that, it starts off talking about the loss of acreage, but then he also says they talk a lot about, say, education. They also talk about the impacts, economic impacts, etc., and so forth. And then when you go to the bottom, and that's sort of the most important thing here in our data set. If you're in descending order, the algorithm said this probably has a 25% probability of belonging to education, 22% of agriculture, 19% of governance, so on and so forth. So as you can see, this is a highly diverse topic, which means that, or article, it's covering almost all the topics in our data set because it's kind of talking a bit about everything. Yeah. Versus on the flip side, a low diversity article. So that's this one here, which is about, it's called Advanced Friendly Cooperation. It's an article from China. It's about Chinese and African relations, and it's about a conference that was being held. Yeah. And if you look at the bottom here, it says it had a topic entropy score of the other side, -3 standard deviations below the mean almost. So it gave it a 99.9% probability of being about this one topic and essentially 0 to everything else, right? So the method works really well because, Lucy by training is a qualitative researcher, and through her I've learned a lot about how to code things. So we actually read a random sample of the articles. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, close to maybe 1,500 of them, so about 1%. And it works quite well. So when you read this, if you did it qualitatively, you would code it as having these themes, and it kind of lines up quite nicely. So you can see that, yeah, okay, this makes sense. This article is primarily about this topic, whereas this article has lots of topics in it. Yeah. And again, just to mention, this is not about bad writing or good writing or styles. It's just about content. The article is clearly well written. It's published in a very good outlet, the premier national outlet. It's just that it's covering more things and discussing them in an interrelated fashion. Yeah. So yeah, in the supplementary materials, we gave some examples, and I already showed you most of the other graphs actually here. All right, so we did that. So hopefully that is clear. And then if I can go back, yeah. Let me just click here. We did one more analysis, which doesn't actually show up in the main paper, but was something one of the reviewers again asked for. They said, well, your dependent variable of diversity or entropy is interesting, but maybe it's a bit abstract. Can you just tell us how does vulnerability impact specific topics? Yeah, it's just probably a more obvious thing to ask. So we also did that. So for each topic, we have 11 of them. We run a separate model now where the outcome is just the probability of an article being about a topic. And then you again look for the coefficients, right? And in this case, we find that out of the 11, 4 models had significant, statistically speaking, coefficients. So we find that countries, as the vulnerability of a country increases, if it's negative, that means it's less. And if it's positive, that means the outcome is more likely. So what we find is that as countries become more vulnerable to climate change in our sample, they speak less about international governance issues and much more about local issues, so national governance, national elites, and less about things such as US politics or international issues, which I think, again, is an interesting kind of finding because it kind of shows that you kind of maybe narrow in, you kind of focus on domestic topics. You worry less about what's happening outside your country. And I think Lucy has, more theoretically interesting explanations for that as well. She can discuss that. All right, so now I'll transition back to Lucy to discuss in terms of the discussion. I can stop sharing as well.
Okay. Thank you very much for all that great detail. I just have to, skip ahead where I left off. So yeah, we found a lot, if you can tell from our review. It was a lengthy review process, and it really made the paper better. But just to go into some of the study limitations, I already mentioned English speaking, but as we all know, right, engagement with print media is declining globally in many countries. I mean, it's very rare now people will pick up actually the physical hard copy of a paper. But that said, audiences for print media remain particularly relevant in countries in our. So maybe that may be the case in the United States, but in India, for example, people are, still picking up the hard copy of the paper. This can also have to do with the in certain countries in our sample, less access to, internet or online news media is still using, the print source. So that was important. And also, print media is still an influential source for local elites that can impact voting choices. Something else, obviously, print media, as you would know, and which studies show, is also highly correlated with what they publish online. It's virtually the same thing, sometimes with different visuals. And that was found to be the case with our sources. And, this was a key limitation, is that we only looked at these English-speaking sources across 26 countries because of obviously the vernacular languages, the diversity of languages in these countries. So we're really missing out on that. But we chose English for a few reasons. One, English is still sort of the dominant language in terms of reaching policy elites and agenda setting. Also, many experts and representatives from the funding agencies are English speaking. And as Sid mentioned, we could really only, because we do speak different languages on the team, but we could only qualitatively verify the topic model findings in English language. So that was one of the important criteria for us, is just to look at those English-speaking sources, though it did limit, our findings. But 100,000 articles is pretty good. There's also some other issues we controlled for that Sid already mentioned to minimize bias in our topic modeling. And obviously, we did conduct a rigorous sort of complementary qualitative analysis where, as he said, we hand-coded 1,500 articles and news articles from each source to sort of really verify what the computer was telling us. That was hugely important, especially when you're using any topic modeling methodology, is to supplement it with a strong qualitative analysis to ensure the accuracy of the findings and what the computer is coming up with. We all know the importance of that today. So in terms of key takeaways, Sid nicely highlighted some of our really most interesting findings in his discussion. But just to reiterate, the three most discussed themes are international governance and development. I mean, we know this intuitively would make sense, right? Because these countries, looking at the climate change negotiations, they're, obviously, and for just reason, seeking funding from the wealthier countries who are responsible historically and currently for climate change. The economics of energy transitions is a huge topic, which makes a lot of sense, as many of these countries are seeking to transition to cleaner technologies, sort of skip all of the extremely problematic industries, the more developed countries have pursued, and the impacts of climate change which they are facing. So these results make intuitive sense, sort of that gut check. And they're also consistent with what other scholars have found, with some slight variations. We also had a larger sample, and sometimes slightly different labels, but consistent with previous literature. But again, highlighting one outcome, given what we're finding about these similarities between South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa versus what you might see in some of the negotiations, just the need for more partnerships and knowledge transfer between these countries, because what they are facing, what's important to them, and what's being covered in their news media is so similar. And so there is potentially more opportunity there to partner, given this the issues they're facing and being reported on. So that's a worth further study for sure. We did, show our hypothesis. There was significant, all the stars, the significant positive association between the country's vulnerability to climate change and the diversity of topics discussed in their media coverage. So that was our, key finding. And this was captured especially well by the Anthropocene headline. But, we are finding the most vulnerable countries. The media is explicitly reporting on this complexity and multifaceted nature of climate change. Now, to this audience, that may sound obvious, but this incredible nuance and sophistication has not been sort of discussed in the literature. And what our paper, I think, is really showing is it's sort of refuting this Western bias in academics and this colonial lens, sort of this reoccurring theme in literature that this climate media literature and journalism in the quote-unquote global South is less robust because of resource constraints, less scientific knowledge. And there are, evinced resource constraints. But we have so much to learn from these countries and the sophistication of their reporting and nuance. The type of journalism there is developmental journalism. It's entirely distinct from Western types of journalism, but it is highly sophisticated, and they're facing the impacts now and the co-occurrence of them, the increasing frequency, and they are making all of these connections. Whereas, in a lot of northern coverage, or global coverage is still extremely difficult for making connections just between health and climate change. That's still difficult. Whereas in these countries, in our sample, it was highly sophisticated, and they were making many connections about how interfaceted the issue is. And that obviously has implications for the audience and interventions and policy responses. So we have a lot to learn, and I think that was a key contribution of this paper to the literature to quantify that, show that here. And so that's it. Thank you very much. Now we're happy to welcome any questions.